While I've been playing around with Melt Durin and Aloy, I also want to talk about Vape Durin, specifically with Mona. Now, I am of course playing with C6 Mona, but it does seem like regardless, Mona is actually a pretty strong character for Durin, especially now that Nicole exists in the game. When Mona got her Hexerei buffs, I think the main direction that Hoyo was trying to take her was as a vaporized driver for an off-field pyro DPS. Because her Hexerei passive involves getting stacks from normal attacks that of course give vaporized reactions from other characters, specifically up to a 15 damage percent buff. They also of course extend her omen duration, which of course means more vapes that can also get the damage percent buff from her ult as well. C1 actually buffs vape damage from off-fielders by 24% instead of just 15%, so long as of course they're off-fielders. C2 gives everyone 80 EM whenever a charge attack lands. Also, on top of that, your charge attacks can happen as part of your normal attack chain now. They have a chance at least to show up. And of course, C4 not only gives a crit rate buff, but for Hexerei characters in particular, it also gives a crit damage buff. So getting her up to C4 is preferred if you want to enjoy a vape buffer playstyle, but if you do manage to get her to C6 like I have, and you do have a relatively decent build, well, it seems like her own DPS is not too bad considering that she is still playing the buffer role. Because Mona is actually a Hydro mage, we can use her normal attacks as a source of Hydro app and thus not rely on her skill alone. That I find to be not that reliable itself. Of course, we're also encouraged to actually do so because of her Hexerei passive, so that's essentially the experience of this team. Hello everyone, welcome back. Before we continue, I just want to remind you all to like the video and subscribe to the channel because your support can always help combat the dreaded YouTube algorithm. To some extent, this team has always existed. We have had characters like Xiangling, who was famously the off-field vape DPS with a Pyronado that can vaporize with no ICD. On top of that, one of the other strong parts of her kit was that she could snapshot attack buffs from someone like Bennett, thus making her damage usually quite significant. But as you can see in the B-roll, we're actually not using Xiangling, and part of the reason is because with the old Bennett Xiangling core, our last two slots would need to be Mona and another Hexerei character just to make Mona work in the first place. Now we do have some options, Sucrose and Fischl. But the bigger problem with running Bennett Xiangling is first off you have to run Bennett, ew, but secondly with Xiangling, she is of course a character who famously has over 3000 ER requirements. That alone, in my opinion, has made this option rather untenable, so I'm not a fan of sticking with the old school methods of 2021. Instead, the idea is to run Nicole and Durin. Now, Durin famously doesn't snapshot buffs, meaning someone like Bennett can't help him while he's off-field. So Nicole's primary strength of being able to provide the attack buff for both Mona and Durin, while Durin is still off-field, is of course going to be quite helpful for the team DPS. The remaining question is once again that final slot. I have tried a few characters and I realized a mistake with one of them. Well, starting off with Sucrose, we seem to run into the same issue with Melt Durin that I talked about a little bit earlier, which is that when you're trying to refresh the Pyro Res Shred after 8 seconds, it is a little annoying and it doesn't necessarily work, especially if Mona's skill is still active and thus a Hydro Aura is kind of preventing things from working. The EM share is still useful though. I guess it's slightly diluted by Mona's already existing EM share. For reference, my Durin build happens to have about 147 EM, so with Mona's EM share, we're already hitting that sweet spot area of around 200 to 300, I think. I also tried Fischl, thinking Fischl's Hexerei buff would be amazing, because why wouldn't it be, right? Overloads give attack percent, Electro Charge gives an EM buff. We can of course trigger both in this team, so surely Fischl is goated, right? Well, it turns out they're only for the on-fielder and Fischl. The on-fielder is going to be Mona in this team, who won't be doing nearly as much damage as Durin, and she's also not going to be triggering the vape buffs herself. This is a reverse vape team for Durin. So, yeah, it looks like Fischl's buffs are going to be rather meaningless, at least for Mona. So at the end of the day, surprise, surprise, once again, C2R1 Shillidan is going to be the strongest option that I have at the present moment. Red Shred for Durin and Mona is good because no matter what, we're not getting any Pyro Red Shred anyway in any real capacity with Durin in this team without someone like Shillidan. I did also have a crack at running this team with Queen Miko. Now what's interesting is that despite this team being a Vape Durin team, ostensibly, thus suggesting that DPS Durin would still be the play, it does seem like going for support Durin instead, and thus enabling Pyro Electro Res Shred, seems to end up with noticeably more DPS. It is an obviously huge spike in Miko DPS, but instead of expecting a similarly huge drop in Durin DPS, we instead actually see only 7% less DPS from him, despite the fact that we are using a version of the ult that has lower talent multipliers, despite the fact that we also have a loss in damage percent from his vape reactions. Apparently, the 35% Res Shred is almost enough to make up for that. Right now, Queen Miko has a couple of gameplay issues with this team, namely of course the turret duration, resulting in having to swap back to her in the middle of rotations. So long as the upcoming Miko buffs remain mostly intact, I'm of course going to be looking forward to trying this team again with, by my estimation, A's new backup Shogun. Yes, I am of course talking about God Miko. So stay tuned for the next patch where we're probably going to be looking a lot more at how we can play Miko in a variety of teams, rather than of course how we can play the new fandangled upcoming character, Sandy Sanderone herself. In summary, Vape Durin seems to be stronger than Melt Durin, at least in my experience. Of course, I don't have certain characters like Sitlali, so maybe she's a bit more of a linchpin for that Melt Durin experience. You can probably still bring Mona and Sitlali together, but if it ends up being Melt Durin, then obviously Mona's Hexerei passive and her C1 buffs won't work, so that's something to keep in mind. But for the time being, I have found Shillidan to be a really good solution. Now you could also lean towards someone like Farina and thus run Medic Mona as well. In this team, I did run into some energy problems specifically on Farina, but I suppose a slight adjustment to the rotation, maybe that is going to be the solution itself. But either way, when it comes to building these characters, I've got Mona running Favgen Noblesse, I've got Shillidan on Scroll and Peak, I've got Nicole on the Hex Scroll and Atlas, and I've got Durin on Hex DPS with Wolf Fang. And with what I have on my builds, I seem to be getting some 122k DPS, which I feel like is actually pretty good. Now for reference, I seem to be getting a very similar amount of DPS with my Mavuika Vape team in the Simulacrum, but keep in mind that team is kind of getting screwed over by the fact that Wolf's Gravestone doesn't have a passive that actually works in the Simulacrum, or I guess even against boss fights except for the last 30% of their HP, which can only mean that power creep is obviously rampant and completely out of control. Oh, speaking of Mavuika, I have also been getting annoyed at the last 10% of crit rate that I just can't seem to make up with my Obsidian pieces, so I'm thinking of just going ahead and grabbing 1000 Blazing Suns just for that reason alone. I know, it's not the strongest reason to go and get 1000 Blazing Suns, but it's going to be my rationale. Looks like I will in fact finally be making at least a light investment into the Pyro Archon. But anyway, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. Have you given Vape Durin some thought, and have you given it a go? Let me know how you're going with that. I did of course also see Jamie's post about his Vape Mona experience with a similar team. Instead of Shillidan, he went for Albedo. Not entirely sure how that helps, maybe the EM buff, but yeah, I would have probably gone for Sucrose, I guess. But either way, considering the nature of some of her buffs explicitly favoring off-fielders and people who are not called Mona, I think I'll stick with Vape Durin for the time being and see how things land moving forward. My personal experience of trying to do some kind of Vape Mona gameplay hasn't exactly worked out, at least for me, so that's basically how we're at. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action, and as always, until next time, I will see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.
for.